My name's Astrid, I'm from the University of Melbourne. I'm the Copyright Communications Officer at the University of Melbourne. First things first, I am not a lawyer, okay? I do not have a law degree, I'm not a practicing lawyer. I am an expert in copyright in Australia. I've worked in copyright in one aspect or another for the last 10 years, getting on 11 and possibly a bit more because I'm not counting back that far. But the amazing thing about Australian copyright law is that it's exceptionally restrictive. The kind of climate that we're in, we really don't have a lot of exceptions that we can rely upon to use things, and that's what makes the way that we've been approaching copyright at the University of Melbourne to be applicable to other countries where we don't have local copyright laws that the US seems to frequently and wonderfully have. So can I get a rough idea from people, what kinds of things do you know that we can use without having to seek permission from the copyright owner? Anyone? Public domain, that's a good one.
For non-profit education.
For educational purposes?
Yeah, non-profit.
Non-profit educational purposes.
Content that you've created yourself, or the instructor has created.
Self-created content, awesome. What else have we got? Open access. Creative Commons. Anything else that anyone can think of? Out of copyright.
What about a graph? As long as you redraw the graph.
Murky territory, murky territory. We'll get into that. That's pretty good. I'm just going to see if there's anything that I missed out on there. Self-created we got, out of copyright we got, public domain we got, readily licensed content, so I would consider that to be Creative Commons licensed material, open access material in some instances. Institutionally owned is one that we didn't quite talk about. It can kind of fall under self-created. Institution-owned content is something that you will need to have a conversation with your institution about. Different institutions have different policies with their teaching staff about whether the material that they create is owned by the university or owned by the original staff. Have a chat to your institution and find out whether material created by professional staff or academics is owned by the university or owned by your organisation, or whether it's owned by the researcher. If it's owned by your institution, it's going to be easy for you to incorporate that material into your MOOC subject because the university already owns copyright in it. Something to think about though is that if your colleague or someone at the university has created it, you may want to just touch base with them, see if they have something that's more updated. They may prefer to use something more recent than what you've currently seen. They may have a better version available. So talking about self-created works. One of the ways which you can use material freely on MOOCs, of course, is to create things yourself. Why? Because when you create it yourself, you're going to own the copyright. Either that or your institution will own the copyright. Do you need to ask yourself permission to use it? No, you don't. Well, you can. You just give it to yourself. Astrid, can I use this? Yes, I can. Awesome. That's what I did with this copyright picture. I drew that, but technically my university owns it because I'm a professional staff member and I created it for work. But I can use it in this instance. Employing a graphic designer. I'm not sure whether any of you have thought of this, but it's something that we've used at the University of Melbourne. In some instances where we have needed a high quality graphic of something that we can't get permission for some reason, we have employed a graphic designer to create something from scratch. So the important thing about creating content, asking a friend or a colleague who might be particularly artistically talented is helpful as well. We were fortunate in our animal behaviour class that we taught through a MOOC that some of our teaching assistants were particularly artistically talented, and they very lovely, kindly drew these amazing diagrams of how birds find food and how deers structure themselves within their families and hierarchies. Things that are created by our staff members can be really useful in providing content for our classes, yes.
So where do you draw the line regarding somebody who takes a diagram and redoes it? So how do you determine if it's a derivative, which might be breaking copyright law?
Exactly. So the important thing about when we're going to be creating our own works under copyright is that you have to be starting from scratch. You shouldn't be directly copying from someone else. If you copy something by hand, you're still making a copy, you're still making a reproduction. You would still need permission to do that. Okay, so we have to be careful that we're not just making a copy by hand. What we're actually doing is creating something from scratch. We can use the knowledge that we have in a subject to create our own original expression of something, and this is where I'm going to go with this. Creating things that incorporate a substantial or recognizable part of an original work could be considered to be an adaptation of the original, or could be considered to be a derivative work. Generally speaking, in most countries, though not necessarily all of them, I can't be across all of the countries' law in all of the world, but in most countries, you can't just create an adaptation or a derivative work from someone's original work without their permission. It's a right of the copyright owner that you need to seek. So the important thing to understand is that copyright doesn't protect ideas or information. It's the expression of those ideas and that information. So when we're talking about creating our own work, if we're going to be looking at a graph that we want to use, your expression of that information has to be significantly different, okay? There has to be enough original human thought into your expression of something in order for it to be a different work, to have its own copyright in it. You will still have to cite the source of your information. It is important for plagiarism issues. You don't want to be accused of plagiarism. You need to cite where you've got material from. So if you have sourced your information from a graph, from someone else's graph or their data, you should be acknowledging that somewhere. It's really important that if you are going to databases that you find online where people allow you to reuse their data, that you have a look at whether they require you to cite their material in a particular way. You have to be careful about reusing data as well, that you're not just taking someone's entire curated collection of data and reusing it. There are different laws about how you can use data, and you should check with the website that you're obtaining data from to make sure that you're not doing something that you shouldn't. You should talk to your local copyright expert if you have one. I can't stress to you how important it is that you have someone on the ground in your team that knows about copyright and local laws that you can work around. In some instances, there are local laws that may apply to you. It's helpful to have someone on your team that is used to reading legalistic things like terms and conditions and agreements so that they can help you interpret how you can reuse content. So out of copyright works was another thing that we discussed. Copyright duration changes depending on what country you're in. It's not universal, okay? So we've got to check whether the material is out of copyright in the country that you're operating in. When you are creating content for your lectures, you are creating it in your country. So your copyright laws are going to apply to that material. Even though it's going to be hosted and communicated on US channels, you are creating the content in your country. You can't rely on other laws that you don't have to create that material where you are, just because it's going to be exposed somewhere else. So be careful about that. Copyright duration also changes depending on the type of content you're using as well. This is another reason why it's really useful to have a copyright expert on hand for you. Someone that is a librarian that has expertise in copyright, a legal counsel that can provide you with legal advice, someone that can help you find out whether the copyright in this material still subsists. The other thing you need to be cautious of is that because we are communicating this material to a global audience, is the copyright material that you're using not only out of copyright in your country, but out of copyright in the country where that material comes from as well. So for example, one of our classes that we've been looking at launching as a MOOC is using a lot of artistic works, and one of the artistic works in particular is by Frida Kahlo. And in Australia, that work would be out of copyright because she passed away in 1945, and we have a 70-year duration. It used to be 50 years, it changed after the Free Trade Agreement. This is common to some other countries that are parties to various treaties and agreements as well. Where we are, that would be out of copyright. So initially I thought, oh great, it's out of copyright, but then I remembered this is a Mexican work and I have to check Mexican copyright law because if it's not out of copyright in Mexico, it is not okay for me to just use that and communicate it to a global audience, including Mexico, if it's still in copyright there. So I checked Mexican copyright duration, and they unusually have a copyright duration of 100 years after the death of the creator. So we're now seeking permission to use that content. So check. Yes?
Can I just ask for clarity? Is the reason you have to check whether it's out of copyright in Mexico because you'd be launching the course to people in Mexico? So if it was a course just within Australia, you wouldn't need to check?
That's right. If I was just communicating that material in Australia, it wouldn't be an issue because it's out of copyright where we are. But because that communication is happening worldwide, I have to check that in the copyright owner's country that material is still out of copyright. Something, like I said, you have to discuss these sorts of issues with your local copyright expert because copyright duration changes depending on where you are, depending on where the material comes from, and depending on the kind of material. Yes?
But that copyright, the second caveat is that you only had to check Mexico and no other place. You checked the originating space.
Yep.
And you checked Mexico and there's no other place you need to check.
The reason why that's an issue and why I don't need to check global copyright law is that generally speaking, and I have to say generally because I can't be across everything, generally speaking, the copyright duration in material doesn't extend beyond the copyright of the country that it originated from. So if for example, it was reversed and Mexico only had 50 years, but Australia had 100 years copyright, I wouldn't be able to give that an increased duration of copyright because it's already out of copyright in the country that it comes from. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Talk to your local
Can
experts.
you say that again?
Okay, so
Briefly, just.
So say I want to use a work from, in the US, right? In the US, they have this copyright law that if it was published in the US before the 1st of January 1923, that work is out of copyright. In Australia, that wouldn't apply. But if I'm using a piece of material that was created in the US and the copyright was owned in the US, and it's out of copyright over there, just because our copyright law in Australia is longer, it doesn't give extended copyright over the duration of that particular work because where it comes from, it's out of copyright. Some things we do have to be careful about, and you won't hear this term anywhere else, but watch out for zombies. If you're in the US, you can ignore this section. If you're from everywhere else, we don't have this fabulous copyright law that Americans have. Which is based on case law. Zombie copyright is what I call copyright in a digitized work of an out of copyright work. So you will find organizations, particularly museums and galleries and other cultural institutions, have taken a photograph, a digital photograph of an out of copyright work, an old painting, for example. And because they have created the photograph and they are the photographer, they have placed a copyright on the photo of that out of copyright work. So they're kind of bringing the copyright back to life. That's why I call it a zombie, is the underlying work is dead, but they've put a new copyright over the top of it that allows them to have you pay for permission to use that material, to pay for licensing to include it. This is not applicable in the US. In the US, we have this awesome case that happened between Bridgman and Correll. And the ruling in that case was, the judge ruled, there is no copyright subsisting in a faithful reproduction of an out of copyright work. Fabulous, awesome if you're in the US. If you're from anywhere else, we can't just apply US case law to where we are. It doesn't work like that. We don't have test case law that we can rely upon in other countries, so we have to avoid that rule. This is another reason why it's important for you to consult with your local copyright expert, because this can happen. So a practical example of this from our standpoint, something that's a real bugbear for me, is that we get a lot of requests to use material from Wikipedia. And often when you go onto Wikipedia these days, you will see a warning notice down the bottom underneath the image that says, this is a faithful reproduction of an out of copyright work. It is also in the public domain. This is based on US copyright law, and it often comes from someone that has uploaded this content in the US where that is okay. If they have cited the source of that material as coming from, say, the National Portrait Gallery of London, that's the source of the content. I will go to the source of that digital image to find out whether the National Portrait Gallery of London has copyright subsisting in that digital image, and most of the time they do. Just for the record, they charge about £75. So we wouldn't be able to use that in Australia. To me, that was a discussion that I had with our legal counsel about whether we could use that, considering that someone in the US had uploaded it as they were allowed to do, saying it's a faithful reproduction. And the decision from our legal counsel, being quite risk adverse, was that, look, the source of that content claims copyright in it, and we don't have case law to support that we can use it. This is why I would encourage you to always speak to your local copyright expert and consult with them on these issues. These sorts of decisions come down to your institution making decisions about what you should be doing, okay? Don't just take what I'm saying about it. Speak with someone locally to make sure that they agree with what I'm saying as well, because it's important that your institution is in control of these decisions.
So what you're saying then is it's still legal in the US, even though it's copyrighted somewhere else.
You have case law to
Some
support
guy-
it.
that just doesn't sound right. But.
You have case law to support. So this particular case, I'd encourage you to go and read it because it's quite interesting. Bridgman are Bridgman Art Library. They're based in the UK. Corolla's a company based in the US. They used a faithful reproduction of an out of copyright work that Bridgman were claiming copyright in, and in the US it was ruled that there was not enough original, creative human thought that had gone into the process of creating that faithful reproduction.
Except for music.
Music is a completely different story. This is a faithful reproduction of an artistic work that's out of copyright. That's what this case law is based upon. So in those instances in the US, you could rely upon that. Again, as I've said, you still need to talk to, even if you're in the US, I would still encourage you to talk to your local copyright expert and ensure that they believe that you can rely on that case law. Decisions to rely on case law have to come from your institution. So public domain works. Public domain is really, really interesting because often when someone says to me, I go, where'd you get this material? Oh, don't worry, it's in the public domain. It's fine, it's in the public domain. I go, yeah. So tell me, what do you understand the public domain to mean exactly? What does that mean for you, it's in the public domain? And that's because over time, the idea of what public domain is has kind of been adopted to mean a whole bunch of things. So a lot of the time you'll hear people say, oh, well, it's on the internet, so it's in the public domain, because their understanding of public domain means it's publicly accessible. That's not what public domain means. Public domain means that the copyright in that content has expired, or the copyright owner has waived their rights over their content. So you can choose as a copyright owner, if you wish to, if you create something yourself, you can choose to donate your work into the public domain so that the rest of the world can do with it what they will. Very generous of you to do so. There are some laws in some places where government bodies, material created by staff that work for a government organisation in some places, the government organisation will automatically put that material in the public domain. You will particularly see this in the US because the policy is really strong. NASA in particular, if you ever want to use NASA pictures, go nuts, they're all in the public domain. Awesome stuff, you can use it because that's the policy they have. Some other countries with their governments also have this. In Australia, it's a bit touch and go. Some of our government agencies do it, not all of them. There's a bit of a push. You'll probably find much the same in your own countries. Some of your government agencies, because they're publicly funded, will allow their material to be in the public domain. You always have to check, always check. Another reason why to check with your copyright expert if you're not sure, but a really good place to find out whether you can use this material or not is going to be in the terms and conditions of the website. So readily licensed content, we talked about open access material. Some open access material. Website terms and conditions, as I mentioned before, are really important, and the reason why I would encourage you to read the terms and conditions for websites where they've got material available for open access is that definitions of open access change. Some people think that open access means it's openly accessible for anyone to view anywhere in the world. That's the definition of open access. Other open access journals you'll find will have this concept that not only can you access that material from anywhere in the world, you can also reuse or redistribute that content. It depends on the individual website, journal, or society what their understanding of open access is. So you really need to read their terms and conditions. Creative Commons, GNU licenses, and copyleft licenses are also example of licenses that exist on content that can allow you to reuse content within your MOOC. You still have to check with the terms and conditions. So, sources of open access material. One of the things we found as a really excellent place that we can find open access material, institutional repositories. There are some fantastic university repositories out there that have been harvesting content from their academics, that have been absolutely proficient in publishing their works left, right, and centre. Not so frequent in the older times, but more recently publishers have had huge demands from their authors to provide them with open access models so that copies of their material can be included in their institutional repositories or their research or departmental websites, okay? So there are versions of their published works that are often put in these institutional repositories. The institutional repository will often advise you that you can't reuse that content, but there's no reason why you can't link students to it and say, read this fabulous paper, it's here. We had an awesome experience with our History of Economics class where one of our amazing librarians took a static reading list and he diligently, with his team of librarians, went through all these international institutional repositories. They found 80% of those working papers and articles had versions that were available for open access in institutional repositories and research and departmental websites. It is worth seeing if the articles you're interested in, if the authors have deposited them in their institutional repository. Open access journals are another great place to look for content. Unfortunately, in this world, there are some disciplines where open access is far more generous than others. Often in maths and science, you will find those sorts of areas of discipline. It's really common for them to release their content and encourage their academics to make their content available on open access. There are other disciplines where this is much more closed off and there's not so much available. So you will hear me say open access is awesome, but I totally empathise with you if you are from a discipline where open access isn't encouraged, because it doesn't happen for everybody.
Sorry.
Yes?
Could you tell us a little bit about if you see data in a journal or paper and it's displayed in a table or a graph, like how you can make a representation of that without it being considered derivative?
Yep. So your expression of something has to be different. So you can't just copy their table and reproduce it as is. If you're going to do that, you're going to need their permission to reuse that. If they have raw data, for example, that states, you know, we found that trees that were this particular age had these particular number of rings or these particular indications, and it's set out in a table, you would be able to reinterpret that information, because that information itself is not protected by copyright. You could recreate that into a graph. You would still have to cite the source of where you've got that information from. It is important that you don't plagiarize the work of others. This is not your data. This is not your information you've collected. It belongs to someone else, and you need to acknowledge them. I would encourage you to read people's website terms and conditions about what you can do. There are some open access journals out there that will allow you to reuse tables and graphs and diagrams as is from those articles, so long as you cite the content properly as they'd like you to do. There are even some copyrighted journals that also allow you to do this as well. One of the first things we do when someone asks us if they can use something in a MOOC is to go and read the terms and conditions and see what it allows. Sometimes we're pleasantly surprised to find, you know what? One graph or two graphs or two diagrams from that particular science journal are totally fine for us to reuse for any purpose, so long as we cite the material correctly. When you are reinterpreting information and creating a new artistic work, graphs and diagrams are considered generally to be protected as artistic works under copyright, interestingly. I would encourage you, before you go ahead with using them, that you at least consult with your local copyright expert, because they will have a better idea of how you've collated the data, whether you need more information or whether you need permission, and they should be able to check for you about citations. Yes?
Sorry, I'm just wondering how the things that we understand we can do with our institutional online learning environments apply to MOOCs. So one of the things we can do is where we have a subscription to a journal or a copy of a book in a library, we can scan up to, I don't know if this is just in the UK or worldwide, but you can scan up to one chapter or one article.
That is amazing if you can do that, because we have a whole bunch of subscriptions to journals, and what you've agreed to in your subscription, whatever your institution has agreed to with the supply of that subscription, sits above anything in your local Copyright Act. So you need to go back to the agreement that your university has made. You'll probably have to consult with legal counsel as well to read through that contract and see if that contract applies to a massive open online course. In most instances, to my knowledge, it won't. I've never seen a database subscription that's used in bricks and mortar classrooms in your online learning within your institution that can be applied to a MOOC so far. I can't, of course, be across every single subscription. There may be some of them allow that, especially if they're open access. A lot of universities have subscriptions to open access journals that would allow that. Again, you would have to go back to the agreement that your institution has with the database or the journal that you've subscribed to and see what that allows. If it's not clear from that agreement whether it allows it or not, you should always go back to the database supplier or the journal supplier and confirm with them whether this contract will also allow you to reuse it. One of the difficulties we would have with that in Australia is that our journal subscriptions are largely based on how many full-time students we have accessing the content. If you apply your MOOC students to that, you just suddenly increase the number of full-time students you have by about 50,000, and they're all non-fee paying students, and you're now paying for them to have it becomes really expensive really quickly. It hasn't been an option for us. If your institution has examined those agreements and finds that it can apply or that they can afford to do that, more power to them, and that's awesome. But you would have to really check that with your legal counsel or local copyright expert. Some open access journals are licensed under Creative Commons. You will find this in their terms and conditions unless they've got it really clearly stated on the front page or every page of their journal. That's possible. Check the Creative Commons license conditions to make sure that it allows you to use for commercial reuse. Now, I say commercial reuse because we are a very risk-adverse university. We see Coursera as a for-profit educational technology company. We note that most of our subjects use Signature Track. Even though Signature Track is optional, there is still money being generated from those things. We are still, in some instances, getting a direct return from having these subjects run. When we request permission from a copyright owner, we will always make it clear that Coursera is a for-profit organisation and whether we're using Signature Track or not and what that means. I cannot make this decision for you. You have to talk to your institution and find out whether your institution believes that your use of material on Coursera is commercial or not. If you're going to be risk adverse, look for material that is available for commercial reuse. Only ever use material that allows for other uses, that mentions non-commercial reuse on Coursera if your institution has agreed with their legal counsel that that's okay. Yes?
I just wanted to go back slightly to the question the lady asked at the front.
Yeah.
Actually, in the UK, I'm not produce information from the database because it's all license-based and full-time equivalent, as you said, and it's for faculty and students, and does not allow extension beyond that.
Yep.
And they encourage people to access the information themselves. So I don't know any other database supplier at the moment who allows that. So you could never extend it to MOOCs.
Yeah, that's been our experience. But again, it would always depend. Like I said, if you subscribe to open access journals or Creative Commons journals, they may have those allowances. One of the cool things about MOOCs becoming so popular is that it's possible that as we march on with this movement, that publishers start to be more sympathetic towards our needs to be able to have selected amounts of content available to our MOOC students as well. Currently that doesn't exist yet, but it'd be nice if it happens. Maybe if we all ask for it, eventually we'll get it. So the other question is, if you can't reuse that content for use in Coursera, can you just link to it? What's the danger in linking your students out to material? Nothing, so long as where you're linking to is a legitimate, definitive source of the content. If someone has legally made it available, there is nothing wrong with you giving a link to your students and saying, this is where you find this thing on the internet that I want you to read. When you provide a link, you are not reproducing copyrighted content. You're reproducing a very small amount of characters that tell people a technical area of where they can find this on the web. That's what links were created for. I am well aware that in some countries there are various issues about how you have to link to something. That's why I would encourage you to check this linking issue with your local copyright expert as well. I'm well aware some places in the US you have to link to the home page rather than linking to the exact page the content is on. As far as I'm aware, there are a lot of countries where that doesn't apply, so check with your local copyright expert as to whether there are any issues with you linking to content. There's not a lot of case law on it. Yes?
What about videos on YouTube?
Videos on YouTube? We'll talk about that in a minute. So website terms and conditions. Some websites will allow you to reuse content in their terms and conditions. Things to look out for: commercial use, use within videos, use on websites, and whether they have attribution requirements. One of the cool things that I found is freedigitalphotos.net allow you to reuse their really high quality stock photo images for pretty well any purpose. Again, read the terms and conditions to make sure that your purpose fits, so long as you provide the attribution that they request. So we've been actively using these high quality stock photos in a lot of our MOOCs because it tells us that we can allow, or that we're allowed to reuse the content for commercial purposes, so long as we provide the appropriate citation and so long as we only use a small version of the work. So that's what we've been sticking to. I just wanted to highlight to you the importance of reading website terms and conditions to see if you can reuse their content, because sometimes they're really surprisingly generous and it's lovely. So, one thing I did want to do is give you a little bit of a look at how we will often... Okay, so if we were going to be looking for images, one of the ways that we would do this, so someone give me an image that you want to use in a MOOC.
An image of...
Sorry? Holocaust. Ooh. Okay, let's see. I hope I can spell it correctly. Oh, that doesn't look right. Is that spelled correctly? A-U-S-T. A-U-S-T. All right. Holocaust. See this section down the bottom here? Usage rights. Have a look at this because this is really helpful. Because we're a risk-averse university at Melbourne University, we will always click this free to use or share even commercially. That's really important. And then we come up with a whole bunch of images. Now, the problem with this process is that what Google is doing is it's picking up any image out there that has been tagged for commercial reuse. The problem with this process is that we don't know how much the person that's tagged the image knows about copyright and whether they're doing it right or not. So in each instance, I would go into the image and investigate why it's been tagged with commercial reuse and check that it's okay. I'm just going to check our time factor, which is not so great. So I might come back to this and just go back into the presentation for a minute to talk to you about things you need to be aware of. So one of the things you'll often find when things have been tagged for commercial reuse, it's because it has a Creative Commons license attached to it, and that tells in the tag that it's available for commercial reuse if that's the kind of license that's been put on it. Can I get a show of hands? How many of you know about Creative Commons? That is so much better than most of my classes that I teach back home. That's awesome. So for those of you that don't know that much about it, Creative Commons is a worldwide recognized licensing system. It applies to any kind of content you want it to as the creator. It's made up of these 4 licensing terms. One particular term is attribution. You will always find attribution is a requirement of a Creative Commons license. That means whenever you use something that's been licensed under Creative Commons, you have to provide attribution to the creator and link back to the source of the content. That is a condition of the license. It says so here. You will find this in the terms. If you can't remember, click on the license. It will tell you what you can and can't do. Non-commercial purposes, you can distribute it and you can reuse it and display it and perform it, but you can't do that if you're going to be doing it for commercial purposes. So for our university's approach, because we believe our use on Coursera is commercial, anything that has this kind of term on it, we wouldn't be just using. If we really wanted the content and it had this term, we'd go and seek permission for it. No derivative work. So we talked a bit earlier about how if you're reproducing a substantial key or distinct part of an original work, that could be considered creating an adaptation or a derivative work. If this term appears on a Creative Commons licensed content, it means you can't make modifications to it. So you can't, in most instances, you can't crop it, you can't put text over the top of it, you can't change colors, you can't change the aspect ratio. The only thing you're really going to be able to do is shrink it or make it larger accordingly. If you wanted to create modifications to a work that had no derivatives on it, you would have to seek permission from the copyright owner to do so. Share alike is kind of like passing the buck, right? So you will never see share alike with no derivative works. And the reason is the whole purpose of share alike is say I create an image and I release it out to you on a Creative Commons license that's very open with a share alike term attached to it. It means I am releasing this work out to you, to the big bad world, and I say you can do whatever you want with it. You can modify it, you can use it for commercial purposes, but because of this share alike term, anything that you do to the image that I've released out into the big bad world under this license, you also have to release your modification under exactly the same license, right? So if I've told you you can profit off my work, you can't change that and then tell people that they can't profit off it. You have to share it under exactly the same license. That's Creative Commons in a nutshell. If you don't know a lot about Creative Commons, go to their website and learn about it because it's incredibly useful in a MOOC. We also have Creative Commons searches, which are really useful. So if you've never been to the Creative Commons search, I recommend you do it. It's a really good way of finding material that's licensed under Creative Commons. So I'm not going to modify in this instance, but I am going to use it for commercial purposes. I could put in my term, which I'm going to change to heart disease, and then say I wanted to find an image on this, or I might go to Flickr and see what I can find there. And what this should be doing, if the internet is working well, is it should be performing a search for me for Creative Commons licensed content in Flickr. You can do this with any of the search engines they allow you to use in order to find that. So just put in your search term, say you want it for commercial purposes, and then choose where you want to go through. Probably Wikimedia Commons, now I'm looking at it, is what's going to give me really good results. Why? Because there's a lot of content on Wikimedia Commons that's medically related. I'm probably going to get more appropriate images than what I would find otherwise, unless this happens. So, but we don't really need to go into that. Go to the Creative Commons search and use that. I want to move on, which is why I'm not going to show you that too much, because the next bit is really important, is that how do you know what you find that's been licensed for commercial reuse or licensed under Creative Commons? How do you know that that's not infringing? How do we know that the person that uploaded that content had the right to do it? How do we know that they know anything about copyright whatsoever? So when someone sends me something and says, I want to use this image in a MOOC, it's licensed under Creative Commons, can I use it? I will always go back to that image and actually check whether it's legitimately been uploaded or not. So what am I looking for? I'm looking for whether the person that uploaded the content is the copyright owner. Why? Because the copyright owner is the kind of person that's going to have a right to upload that content and put a license on it. If they're not, I'd be a little bit suspicious. Is it likely that they have the right to communicate it? So maybe they're not the copyright owner of the work. Maybe they're an open access journal, for example, where they maybe don't own the copyright in the material. Someone's licensed it under Creative Commons for that journal. But does that open access journal have the right to communicate it? They probably do. So it's probably a source of content where that material is being made available legitimately. Is there any copyright information present? Most instances, but not always. Most people that are protecting their copyright will have some kind of copyright statement attached to their work, either in the website terms and conditions or actually attached to the work itself or on the same page that appears. You find a lot of people in their blog posts and their blog pages, especially ones where people are traveling through France, which we've been using a lot because one of our MOOCs focuses on some particular country areas in France. We've been able to find some fabulous bloggers who have gone traveling through France, who've put up pictures of themselves going through country areas, Brie and all sorts of wonderful places. And we've been able to find that through going into their statement at the bottom of their page that they actually allow us to reuse it so long as we link back to their site and say that it's their photo. So always check those things. Is there copyright information present? Because it's more likely if it's there that that work is legitimate. Is there relevant branding? So you asked me about looking for stuff on YouTube. So when we're going to YouTube, there are some tricky issues that we have to think about. There are two types of licenses that apply to content on YouTube. Content on YouTube is either licensed under a standard YouTube license or under a Creative Commons license. The Creative Commons license is really open. It's usually a CC BY 2.0 license, unless they've recently updated it, but it wasn't the last time I looked at it. If it's a standard YouTube license, that's akin to being all rights reserved, i.e. you cannot use that video unless you have permission from the copyright owner. But if it's legitimate, you can link to it. So say you wanted to send your students to a clip from BBC David Attenborough's Life of Birds. Okay, where are we going to go on YouTube to find that content? If I do a search for David Attenborough's Life of Birds, I'll probably get 50 million people's YouTube sites where they've ripped it off TV or they've ripped it off wherever and put it up. There are a couple of reasons why that might be an issue. Depending on what country you're in, linking your students to infringing content could be considered an infringement in itself. That's the case in Australia, but it's not like that for everyone, I know. You want to make sure that what you're linking to is legal because it could be removed at any moment, and you have massive issues if you're linking 50,000 students to a clip for an exercise and all of a sudden YouTube's removed it because it's infringing. So you go to definitive sources. I'd go to the BBC's YouTube channel to get their content, to link students to it, to say watch it on the BBC channel. Don't watch it on Joni Loves Documentaries with David Attenborough because Joni probably doesn't have permission to make that available. You want to go to definitive sources. If I went to the BBC's YouTube channel, I would find there would be relevant branding for the BBC. They would have all of their branding for their particular channel that would be up there. All the BBC logos would be there. There would be links to all of their other YouTube channels that they have that are related to them. BBC 2, BBC 4, all the other BBC channels that I'm sure that there are. You would have links back to their websites as well that would all go back to their authorised websites too. You should be looking for all of these things. Now, by no means when you look at all of this does it necessarily mean that it's definitely legal. But you have enough reason to infer that it has all of those things, that it helps you to decide that with reasonable inference, this is probably legal, a legitimate place to go. The reality is in a court case, they're looking for you to be making reasonable judgment upon these things. They don't expect you to know when someone's putting up a really good fraud. If it looks right because it has all of those things, you're probably going to be okay. Yes?
You're talking about this from an institutional perspective.
Yep.
Right? So the institution should not put up these connections, but what is the responsibility in your mind of the institution relative to when students post these sorts of things?
Really, really good question. This is a conversation you need to have with your institution. At the University of Melbourne, we found students were starting to put up links to stuff that we believed was infringing copyright. We believe that the University of Melbourne has responsibilities for channels and Facebook pages that we're managing and discussion forums that we're managing and we're administering. We believe we have a responsibility to make sure that content that students are being directed to is legal. So where we find students linking to things that are blatantly infringing, we will often remove that and advise the student, really sorry to do this to you, but unfortunately we believe that the material that you've linked to is infringing copyright, and we do not encourage students to access infringing material. We haven't had any backlash from doing that. Students have been really understanding when we've said that. So up to your institution to make decisions about that. As I said, it may depend on your local laws in that particular instance, whether it's really an issue or not. That was our approach to it. Have a chat to your institution and find out whether they believe that that responsibility lies with them or not.
It's possible to kind of put something in the honor code, isn't it? On Coursera, you could put something there that might help with that.
Yep, you could.
We're still talking about potentially thousands or tens of thousands of posts and discussion forums, and the practical side of
You make a
sort of
reasonable effort.
enforcing that is a challenge.
You make a reasonable effort. You can't be, You can't have all your eyeballs everywhere at once. Where you see it happening, where you notice that you have a response, or where we see it and we notice that we believe we have a responsibility to take action and remove that content. It's quite possible that there are forums that I haven't seen or that none of our teaching staff have managed to see that have that, but where we notice it, we take action. What's the quality of the material you're looking at? If it's high quality content, it's more likely that it's going to be okay. It's unlikely that a copyright owner would be putting up really low quality content that looks like someone's taken a video camera to their TV and filmed that bit, okay? So look for these consistency issues. Consistency is a really good thing to have a look at. If you're looking at someone's Flickr photo stream, so we get a lot of our images from Flickr, licensed under Creative Commons. How do I know that this image is legal? I'm looking for all of these things, but I'm also looking through the photo stream of that person to see if the photos are consistent. If they have a whole series of photos of dogs that are really blurry and their kids going, and then all of a sudden they have this amazing photo that looks like it could be on the front of National Geographic, I'd be really suspicious about whether that was okay or not. If I desperately, desperately wanted to use that image because it was absolutely perfect, because I'm suspicious, I just send them an email and I just ask them, is this your photo? Did you take it? Do you own the copyright in it? I just make sure. Not sure? Ask. Better to be safe than sorry. Doesn't make sense. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. If you find a picture of Dora the Explorer licensed under Creative Commons or Mickey Mouse licensed under Creative Commons, it's probably not going to be legitimate. Why? Because the organisations that own the copyright in this material like to commercialise off it. They're a business, that's what they do. Is it likely that they're going to allow the world to reuse their very commercial content for whatever purpose? Not likely. So be suspicious. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. If it's possible, maybe you want to check. If you really desperately want to check, check. So this was one of the experiences we had, was that someone said, we want to use a picture of Brad Pitt in our MOOC. I went, okay. They said, can we use this one? I said, no. They said, why not? I said, because I had that poster on my wall when I was 14, and so I know that it's not licensed under Creative Commons. So that was the end of that one. Then they said,
Can we use your poster?
then they said, what about this one? Can we use this one? Went, that's a really nice photo of Brad Pitt. But gee, who's this Red Romero Ramos guy? And gee, that was actually on Flickr originally. So I'd probably go back to Flickr and go, yeah, let's look at this. Well, gee, it says it's Chanel number 5. I don't know why Chanel number 5 would be making their awesome picture of Brad Pitt available for anyone to use under Creative Commons. And then I look at the other photos that this guy has. Does this guy look like he's capable of taking that photo of Brad Pitt? I don't think so. Is it his? Probably not. So I said, no, we're not using that one. Then they said, what about this one? And I said, maybe. So I had a look at it. Eva Rinaldi. That's a picture of her with a really, really expensive camera. Really expensive. Then there's all this information on the side about what was happening when this photo was taken. Brad Pitt was at the World Z premiere and he was walking on the red carpet. It was in Sydney. She happens to be Sydney based. I went into her profile. She's got all these links, legitimate links to legitimate websites, encouraging people to go to all of the cool stuff that's protected by copyright from the sites that they come from. And I find out down here that she is a photographer, Eva Rinaldi Photography. So what am I finding? Is it likely that she took this photo? I go into her profile, I find out she's a photographer that takes photos of celebrities and music festivals and events in Sydney. Is it likely that she was hanging around with the paparazzi on the red carpet when Brad Pitt walked down in Sydney? Yes, it is. Is it likely she took this high quality photograph? Well, she's a photographer. Yeah, it probably is. Is it likely that she's licensed it under Creative Commons because she knows what she's doing? Yeah, it is. Why is it probably likely? It's probably likely because she's using the photos of Brad Pitt she has that aren't overly professional so that she gets her name out there on everybody's blog website that wants to put up a picture of Brad Pitt. Licensed under Creative Commons, so she's going to get a link back to her site. She's going to get her name out there. It works for her business. She's not putting up her super duper fantastic picture, but she's putting up one that people can use. So yeah, that was okay. So check the consistency. Work out whether the person that's uploaded it actually has a right to do so. Does it all make sense? If it all makes sense, then it's probably good to go. So don't worry too much. So one of the things that people say to me all the time, because I harass them about copyright, that's my job, they go, man, who's going to know? Can't I just use it anyway? I hate that question, but the reality is you would be surprised. So our animal behaviour class wanted a picture of a tiger marking its area. And they found this picture and said, we want to use it, can we? And we looked at it and we investigated and we found that, yeah, it's licensed under Creative Commons. It's available for commercial reuse. You can totally use it. But one of the exciting things about this and why I'm showing it to you is because this question of who's going to know, well, it kind of turned out that the copyright owner just happened to be taking the class, recognised his photo being used, and he put up a really lovely post on the forum saying, oh my God, that's way cool, you used my image. Isn't Creative Commons a wonderful world? But it highlighted to us that anyone can be taking your course. The copyright owner can be taking your course. They are going to notice. If we'd done the wrong thing, if we hadn't used the Creative Commons license correctly, if we hadn't cited him as the creator of the work and linked back to his site, instead of a really positive message, that could have been a really negative and potentially really damaging message. It could have even led to an accusation or to some kind of litigation. So who could be watching? They could be watching. We also used some BBC content in our class as well. We licensed that content. Cost us a fair bit of money to do, but we did the right thing. We licensed it. And then we found out, funnily enough, that one of the team from the BBC, one of their animal programs, was actually enrolled in this class as well. And they were so inspired by one of the things that our lecturers was teaching about animal camouflage that they put up a note to say, oh my God, I was so inspired by this that for our next BBC program, where we talk about animals for kids, I'm going to do this bit on animal camouflage. And then they gave us a link when they'd finished it so that everyone in the course could go and watch it. So it's not just the copyright owner, it could be someone that works in the business that's associated with the copyright of that material. They could have a chat next to the water cooler, hey, taking this class or this content, do you reckon they licensed it? People can notice. You never know who's watching, they could be watching. And this all comes down to me talking about seeking permission. So when do we need to seek permission? When it doesn't fit under any of the other things that we've talked about, you will need to seek permission. So, when you can't rely on anything else. When you want to do more than what you're allowed to do. So you might remember I talked about those Creative Commons licenses. They may not allow you to reuse it for commercial use. They may not allow you to make modifications on it. So if you want to do something that's more than what you're already allowed to do, you're going to need to seek permission to do that. And who do you ask? In most instances, although not always, you will have to speak to the copyright owner, who could be the creator. But it may not be the copyright owner, it could be someone that manages the copyright. For example, galleries often don't own the copyright in the photographs they have on their website of their material, or they don't often own the copyright of the artistic works that actually are in their gallery. But they can facilitate those permissions for you, so they manage the copyright on behalf of the copyright owner. So sometimes it's the manager of the copyright rather than the copyright owner. The creator is often the copyright owner in the first instance, but we should all know this changes often in our institutions. We create material, but we're not the copyright owners, our institution is. So the copyright owner can change. You need to do a bit of research to find out who you need to contact. Often a publisher is going to be a content owner of material, or a manager of copyright, or a copyright owner. A lot of people, when they sign publishing contracts, assign their copyright over to the publisher. This is a bugbear for a lot of our academics who are now taking our MOOCs and going, oh no, it's fine, we can reuse chapters from my book, I own the copyright, I wrote it. And I go, really? Really, do you? Can I see a copy of your publishing contract? Or can you go back and read your publishing contract and confirm for me that you didn't assign all the rights in your content to the publisher? Probably about 8 times out of 10, they come back to me and go, actually, you're right, I don't own copyright. Why did I do that? And I go, because you probably didn't read your contract. So it could be the publisher. Producers of films often own or manage the copyright in films that they produce. That's quite common. One of those things you'll have to investigate. Sometimes a distributor may be able to distribute the rights to you. A local distributor may be able to facilitate the licensing process for you rather than you contacting the production company. Collecting rights organisations can be a big help in terms of licensing content on behalf of creators and copyright owners. So In Australia, we have Copyright Agency Limited. They manage copyright on behalf of a lot of artists of work, and so we can go through them as a collecting rights society to license content. They'll contact the copyright owners on our behalf and facilitate that. Most of you will have rights societies in your countries that will manage things on behalf of music and other types of works as well. Institutions and galleries can also own copyright, so they might be who you need to seek permission from in order to get material. If you have a colleague at another university and you want to use their content, you should be finding out whether they actually own the copyright in it. It may be their institution that owns the copyright, so they may not be able to give you permission. You might actually need permission from the institution and not for them. So what do we do with permissions? How do we ask for them? You want to tell them who you are. I'm Astrid. I'm the Copyright Communications Officer at the University of Melbourne. The content we want to reproduce. We would like to reproduce this fantastic journal article that you have available. It's by this person. We provide a full citation of who that is. The rights that we're requesting. We are requesting a worldwide non-exclusive license to reproduce this content in our MOOC. We tell them that we have a partnership with Coursera. We tell them who Coursera are. We explain that they're a for-profit educational technology company that we're working with to provide these free courses. We explain what a MOOC is. Believe it or not, while it might be abundantly clear to us what a MOOC is, a lot of copyright owners out there have no idea. It's only about a year and a half since we started doing MOOCs that when we're contacting people, they're like, oh, a MOOC, yeah. A lot of the time, they're not really sure yet what a MOOC is, or they might know, but they haven't worked out a licensing structure yet, so explain to them what it is. Explain to them that content's only going to be made available to enrolled students. You've already told them that a MOOC is a massive open online course that anyone can enroll in so long as they have internet access. It's important then that you clarify for them that students still have to be enrolled in that subject to access the content once it's made live. They still have to go through an enrollment process. You have to explain to them that what your MOOC is and who's teaching it. This can be really useful, particularly in particular discipline areas. If your lecturer is really well known in the industry, it is going to help your permission go through if your publisher knows exactly who your lecturer is. You want to tell them the context of what the MOOC is about as well. We're using it in a French Revolution subject because they may want their content to be used and perceived in that kind of discipline and that kind of area. So how you intend to use it and the content within it. So you want to make sure that the copyright owner that you're contacting for permission understands exactly how you're incorporating this material into your subject. This is because they may have objections to how it's being used. So you need to be clear with them so that you can confirm, so you don't lose any sleep, so they don't come back to you later because you told them that you were just going to use it in a video, but actually you were also making a PDF version for students to have as well. You need to be clear on exactly how that content is going to be incorporated. So, where it's going to be reproduced. Is it just going to appear on the Coursera website, or is it going to appear on YouTube as well? So in our instance, we found initially when we're requesting permission from our promotional videos, because our promotional videos are also appearing on YouTube, it's important that we tell the copyright owners if we're requesting for the promo video that promo video is also available on YouTube for anyone to see. Versus when we're just using it within our video lecture, which is only available through the Coursera website. How long you want to use it for. So am I requesting a license just for this run of the class because it's quite possible that the lecturer might change their mind after this, or it might be particularly expensive so we're not sure if we're going to go ahead in the next year or not. Maybe you know you're going to use it again, so maybe you want to ask for a 3-year license to use it for future iterations of the class, for example. So that covers you so that you don't have to go back and renegotiate permissions later on. If you're using signature track and what that is, really, really important. Why? Because there is some kind of funds that are being generated out of using signature track. So it's important that you are transparent about this. This may change how the publishers feel about, or the content owners feel about making that content available to you. It's important that you're transparent. The last thing you want to do is not say anything and have them come back to you and go, well, we've had other MOOC requests, people are using signature track, are you using it or not? That might change the licensing fee that you've agreed to. They might get upset that you haven't been transparent with them. So make sure you explain what signature track is and how it works. It's optional. Not all students take it up. How much the signature track is for that class, for example. You're trying to give the publishers and the content owners enough knowledge to make an informed decision about how they're licensing this content to you so that there's no surprises that come up later on. Really important that you explain that you make sure that you're going to acknowledge them. We would like your permission to use this. We reassure you that we are going to provide a link back to your website and a full bibliographic citation for the content. I would always also ask them if they have a preferred method of citation. Often they do, and it's important that you include that. And your deadline, okay? Your publisher or your content owner that you're requesting permission for, they get a lot of permission requests, especially if they're a big company. If you don't tell them what their deadline is, what your deadline is, they could take a month to get back to you, 2 months to get back to you, 3 months to get back to you. Sometimes they'll do that anyway, but it helps if you tell them, this is our production schedule. If at all possible, we would like an answer by this date in order to fit in with our production schedule. That will help them to prioritize your request. So, what to expect? Okay, I've got 15 minutes. Time, it can take a lot of time, anywhere from 3 days to 3 months. Sometimes it takes longer. When we licensed the BBC content for our animal behaviour class, it took me 4 months to clear the copyright for that. Why? Because it had on-sold the ownership of that material about 4 or 5 times and people lost track of who actually owned the copyright in it. And I got transferred to a Pacific office and then to the UK office and then to the education office and then back to the UK again. Permissions take time. It's important that you make your faculty aware that if they're requesting something that it may take a lot of time to come through. They might need a backup ID just in case permission doesn't come through. Researching and confirming the rights and negotiations and obtaining a copy can take a lot of time. We requested permission to use some Tour de France footage in one of our exercise physiology subjects, and the French company that produced that content insisted that we use a copy, a high quality version of that material that they had, and they insisted on sending us a hard copy of that material in the post. That took 2.5 weeks to arrive down in Australia. So be aware that some of these things may take time. Following up. Sometimes you have to follow up your requests. Don't just send a request once and hope that someone's going to get back to you. If you don't hear back from someone in a week after you send a request, touch base with them and just say, hi, such and such, I sent the email below last week. I just wanted to confirm that you've received my request. We live in a world where people get lots of emails, things get lost, servers go down. If you haven't heard in a week, check and make sure that they've received your request. Sometimes I contact them, they're like, oh no, sorry, we must have missed that, or our server went down, or they have some reason, so make sure that they've got it. Touching base to track progress and answer questions is also really good. Sometimes if it's been sort of, I know that they've got it, but it's been 2 weeks, I will touch base with them and just say, just wanting to track the progress, you know, are there any particular issues? Is there anything I can help with? Do you have any questions? Just see where they're at. Sometimes a gentle reminder is really, really useful. Don't harass them, but just a gentle touching base, just a friendly touch base. I just want to know how you're going with it. Fees. A lot of copyright owners are going to charge fees. They have a right, because they are the owners of this content, to charge what they believe the value for it is. You should be respectful of that. Never ever go back to the copyright owner and go, that's ridiculous, that's outrageous, I'm not paying that. That's what some of my lecturers say. I go, no, we don't have the right to say that. This is the value they place on their work. I understand if that's beyond the budget, so let's go into negotiations and see what we can do. So you may need to negotiate for more affordable fees, so ask about how that can be possible. Look, unfortunately, within our budget, we can't afford to pay that kind of fee for this material. Is there any way that we can adjust the fee? What if we use the material for a smaller time period? What if we only make it available for 3 months? What if we use less? What if we only use, you know, half a page versus a whole page? What if we only use 1 diagram rather than 2? Talk to your faculty about any negotiations, because they need to know what kind of negotiations you're having with the content owner. So flat fee versus a fee per student. Sometimes content owners will want you to pay for students. They don't always understand the difficulties that MOOCs have such fluctuating enrolments that you never actually know how many students are enrolled in your class until the class is actually over. So you may need to make it clear to them that charging a fee per student isn't going to work, and is it possible that they could come up with a flat fee that would suffice, because your enrolments are always going to change, and when you have non-fee paying students, you can't necessarily pay 10 cents on behalf of all 50,000 students, because that's still a lot of money. So you can lessen the amount that's used. Research standards, find out what is standard for using content in this kind of way. That can be hard with MOOCs, but sort of see if there's any research out there that will tell you what you should be aiming for when you're negotiating for this sort of thing. And again, faculty need to be consulted about your negotiations. Signing agreements. Be careful about who is authorised to sign agreements. Sometimes a copyright owner will ask you to sign an agreement. It doesn't mean that you're lecturer or that you can sign the agreement. It's really important for your institution that you contact someone with the authority to advise you who has the right to sign on behalf of the university to use this content. Always check. And vice versa. If you are contacting someone from somewhere requesting permission to use something and they sign off it and say, yes, you can use it, who are they and do they have a right to give you that license? If they're just the admin person, they may not have the right. You may need to actually get permission from the head editor or something like that. So check that people have authorization to do that. Check conditions that are attached to any licensing agreements or any permissions that you get back from a copyright owner. It may be things like you can use this without permission, but you have to cite your material as reproduced with kind permission from blah, blah, blah. They may have specific ways in which they're licensing this content to you, so check and see if there's any special conditions that they attach to giving you a license to use the material. Okay, what else have we got? Invoicing. This has been a bit of a drama for us. It sounds really obvious, but your faculty may not have had conversations about how things are going to be paid for, how they're going to be facilitated, whether they can use credit cards, whether they can transfer money, whether they can use a check. So make sure that there are procedures put in place with your faculty to deal with things, because the last thing you want is for faculty to go, that's great, $500, happy to pay that. And then later on when you go, okay, so you haven't paid the invoice yet. And they go, what? But I thought you, but who, but oh, we can't. So make sure there's procedures and everyone understands. So what do you do when permissions fail? What happens if I don't get a response? No response is not an implied license to just go ahead and use something, okay? If someone doesn't get back to you, it doesn't mean you can use it. It may mean that that work has been orphaned, okay? An orphaned work, generally speaking, is where the copyright owner cannot be identified or located. This is a serious issue. Being an orphaned work doesn't just mean you can use it either. You have to have a conversation with your copyright or legal expert at your institution to find out whether they believe that you can use this material as an orphaned work. That's really, really, really important, okay? It does put your institution at risk, so someone needs to make an authorised decision about that, so be careful. What if the permission is denied? You can't use it anyway either, okay? Just because they deny it, you kind of have to deal with that. So what do? Find a copyright-friendly alternative. Can you spend some time finding some similar images that are licensed under Creative Commons? Can you seek permission from someone else? Is it possible to re-express the idea in a different way? Do you have a colleague at another university that's already done a lot of research in this area that might be able to grant you permission to use some of it? Find out if there's an alternative. Can you link to it if it's openly accessible? Just because you can't get permission from the BBC doesn't mean you can't link to the clip on their YouTube website, okay? So can you link to it instead? And discuss with your institution if it's appropriate to ask students to source their own copies. So some of you may have done MOOCs already, or maybe speaking to people that have done MOOCs with a lot of content like musical works or movies, books that they can't get the rights to. In some instances, some of the strategies is we've asked our students to source their own copies. Students are resourceful, but it's a conversation you have to have with your institution, and you may want to talk to Coursera about this, because be aware you have a global audience from different socioeconomic groups. They may not have access to a local library where they can borrow it. They may not have that copy in English somewhere where they can access it. They may not have a copy in their language so that they can understand it. So you need to discuss whether it's appropriate to have students source their own content.
Can you speak a little bit about the Core Public Domain Library?
The Core Public Domain Library. In what respects?
Well, do you know what I'm speaking of?
I do.
And so, theoretically, if you look at it, it says all of these works are allowed to be reproduced.
Yep.
So,
Largely American based, so double check. The public, my understanding of the public domain library is that it's based on American copyright law on what has fallen into the public domain. So because public domain can mean out of copyright, or that the copyright owner has waived their rights over the material, just because it's out of copyright in the US doesn't mean it's out of copyright in other countries. So just it's a good source to go to, really good place to start. Just double check that it's also out of copyright in the country that it was created in and not just in the US, just to make sure. Or talk to your local copyright expert if you're not sure. That's just my understanding. I'd be wary of those sites. I just double check they're right. Most of the time they are completely correct, but I double check because otherwise I'll lose sleep. But I'm a little bit crazy, so you know. Yes?
Is there any difference between the public domain license and the CC0 license?
Yeah, so Creative Commons, thank you for bringing this up. Creative Commons have made it apparent for you because it's so worldwide recognised. They've actually created a public domain licence so that you can easily declare to people in a way that they will recognise that you are releasing your work into the public domain. My understanding from when I've looked at it is they are literally saying you can use this for any purpose. I'm putting it in the public domain. It's just to make it really clear to people because people are so familiar with Creative Commons these days. Makes it easy to recognise that this person has decided to waive their rights or that they've sourced it from somewhere where it's out of copyright everywhere because it's, you know, a 15th century science textbook or something. Yes?
Earlier when you were saying about when we need to seek permission, you said we need to seek permission if it's not, doesn't fall under the areas we've discussed. And we discussed all of those apart from the one I wasn't sure about when you wrote it down, which was non-profit/educational purpose.
That is because we had this discussion before about whether we consider things to be available for commercial reuse on Coursera is a discussion that you have to have with your institution. For me, this non-for-profit educational purpose doesn't work for Coursera because the conversation I've had with my legal counsel at our institution is that because Coursera is a for-profit technology company and because there's possibly signature track or other ways of us creating and generating an income from our courses, this wouldn't apply. Educational purposes is a really interesting one. Remember when you look at websites that when someone has created website terms and conditions that say you can use this for educational purposes, depending on when that was written, they might mean you can use it in your bricks and mortar class. Their concept of educational purposes may not extend to use in a MOOC. So whenever I come up across something that does say, we allow this freely usable for educational purposes, I will always touch base with the copyright owner and say, your website says that we can use this for educational purposes. I just want to check that your understanding of educational purposes means things that are educational in nature and isn't just limited to use within the classroom, because there are a lot of people out there that are very firm on that. Again, I'm a bit crazy, I get paranoid, I will lose sleep if I don't check that, make sure that their understanding of educational purposes is the same as mine. So I would always double check that. Yes?
I have a question. We're talking a lot about preventing copyright infringement. But
Yep.
what if for whatever reason an image or a video is going to be used in a MOOC and despite all these safety measures it is copyrighted and it's used illegally, so to speak? The owner finds out and files a lawsuit. Who is liable, and should the institution have some prepared plan for action should something like that happen?
That is way out of my area of authorization to be talking on. If that's something that you would have to have a conversation with your institution about, you should be talking to your legal counsel about it. Obviously, you should be avoiding it at all costs, but you should have a contingency plan for what is going to happen if something was to happen. What would you do? So first things first, Coursera, because they're the hosting platform, would probably receive a DMCA notice because they're based in the US. They operate under a DMCA notice system. They'll get a notice to remove the content. They'll probably take it down immediately and notify us that they've received a DMCA notice and the material has to be removed up until such a point that we can prove that the right thing was done with it or whatever. This is an issue. You don't want material to be removed from your course because it's going to create intense chaos for everybody. That's why you want to avoid it at all costs. This is why I'm a little bit crazy about it, because I want our MOOC to run smoothly, but Coursera will receive a DMCA notice. You will have to go through a process of either proving that you're using it under license or as you're allowed to do so under copyright law. But until such point as you can prove that successfully, that material will have to be removed. And that could be really chaotic for your course, so you would want to avoid it. Whether it moves from beyond that DMCA takedown notice to an actual litigation is something completely separate, and it would need to be discussed with your institution and a lawyer and probably Coursera as well. You would need to get everyone involved in that.
Are you by any chance aware of any precedent of such lawsuits?
No. To my knowledge, there has been no case law surrounding anything that's ever been used in a MOOC.
Yeah.
I don't know about anybody else in this room. I do not want to be a case test. Neither does my institution. That's why we are making sure that we're really risk adverse in our approach to using things, because, look, legal cases, lot of time, lot of money. Even if they work out in your favour, it's still a lot of time, a lot of money, and it's still really disruptive. So you just want to avoid it at all costs. But again, you should be having these discussions with your institution and your legal counsel or your copyright expert so that you're all on the same page with what you're doing. So this is just a slide to sum some stuff up. If you haven't read it, start reading it. But I'm sure that Coursera will make this all available, and it's all on film, so you can see it anyway. But just going over the stuff that we've talked about, I'm just conscious of the time because we're just on time. Well done. So moving forward, let's keep this conversation about copyright going. I know that you guys have questions. I tend to be pretty active on the forums. I have got tags so that every time someone writes something in a forum on the Coursera Partners forum and tags it with copyright, I get an email to say, hey, someone's posted about copyright, and I will go in there and answer your question pretty well straight away. Okay? If I don't because I'm ridiculously busy, nudge me and say, hey Astrid, I have this question and no one said anything, and I'd really like, and I would do my best to help you. But the reason why I would prefer you to go to the forum rather than email me is so that our conversations are on record on Coursera for other new partners to discover when you've had problems and we've all found answers to it. You may have local knowledge that I don't know, you may have received legal advice. Share our experiences. Did you get permission from someone? What happened? How did it happen? Was it a good experience? Was it a bad experience? Hey, this publisher knows exactly what a MOOC is and they're really understanding. If you've got stuff, they're really easy to talk to. Share these experiences so that we can all help each other and we can all learn from it, because it's really, really useful. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes?
I believe there's a MOOC currently under development on this topic.
Oh, fabulous.
It's a partnership between Duke and University of North Carolina.
Kevin Smith is one of my heroes. If anyone is from Duke University, tell him I love him. He's awesome. Yeah, so, and I'm not sure whether that's going to have an international approach or whether that's going to be US based. Again, you kind of never know until you get in there. But again, keep the conversations going, because what I've found in forums before, when someone's asked a question, people do chime in and say, well, actually, where I'm from, we're allowed to do this. And other people will say, well, where I'm from, that's not okay. And usually if there's a whole bunch of people that aren't sure, someone from Coursera will come in and say, this is the best approach. But usually we work it out before anyone from Coursera has to say anything. So jump on the forums, keep the conversations going. Talk to me, talk to each other, share your experiences so that we can all learn from each other the best ways to get material that we can all reuse in our MOOC subjects. Thank you so much for coming.